This is called How Many Times? I don't remember a time when war wasn't on the tips of everyone's tongues. Every page of the history books is littered with it. Even our ancient text tells us who to go to war with. In the recent memory of our grandparents, there was the war to end all wars. And soon after that came the next one. They've made movies and TV shows about the intermediary wars. The peace and love of the 60s went hand in hand with Vietnam. And then there's the modern wars that have gone on so long we forgot they were happening. What a surprise when they ended and people were mad for some reason. This intrusion into Ukraine may be my 13-year-old's first war, or at least the first one he gets to experience from the beginning. I remember when my people left Russia. It seems the Tsar is still at it. He wears a modern suit now. He tells cameras and phones lies about what isn't really his. He sits in an office far from where the cannonballs fly.
So, as we gather tonight on Shabbat, as Jews around the world and as people of all faiths will be thinking about in their places of worship this weekend, wondering what will happen in the coming days and praying for peace most of all, I have an unusual perspective, and it's a perspective that many of you might share, given the fact that most of us here in this room actually come from the region where this war is happening right now. Understand that your great-grandparents, maybe even grandparents, but almost as certainly all of our great-grandparents, great-great-grandparents about 100 years ago, 150 years ago, were living in the region where we're seeing tanks roll through right now and fighters bombing literally the places where we lived, where our families lived. Now, we didn't call ourselves, for the most part, Ukrainian Jews, because in the 1880s, 1860s, 1870s, as our people were preparing to leave the places that we saw in places like, not really Anatevka, but those kinds of places, that's where those places were, in the Pale of Settlement. And we didn't call ourselves Ukrainian, we called ourselves Galicianers. And almost everyone here has an ancestor who was a Galicianer from that area that was part now of Ukraine, but at some points part of Russia, at some parts part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And a lot of us have family stories where they would say, well, sometimes we were part of Austria, sometimes we were part of Poland, depending on the week, right? But the reality was there was fighting going on in that area for many, many years. But we very rarely referred to ourselves as Ukrainian Jews. It's only in the last about 30 years that Jews started referring to themselves as Jews from Ukraine. Because in reality, Ukrainian independence was oftentimes fleeting, and oftentimes, as we talked about Tuesday and Wednesday class, we actually digressed and talked about it a little bit. Oftentimes, Ukrainian independence was matched and went hand in hand with horrible acts of anti-Semitism. But the reality is that for those of us who are Galicianers, there was really two groups, right? There was the Galicianers in the south, and there were Litvaks in the north. And if you were a Litvak, you knew you were a Litvak, and if you were a Galicianer, you knew you were a Galicianer, because usually the Litvaks would make fun of you for being a Galicianer. But the reality was there were very different types of people, and in reality, they oftentimes didn't even marry within the group, because they stayed in their group and they stayed in their group, and the stereotypes were the Litvaks were the more uptight people, they were the more religious people, they were the more efficient, and the more in many ways the more religiously observant to the detail. Whereas the Galicianers were a little bit more laid back. It was actually in that area where Hasidism started. It was the birthplace of Hasidic Judaism, which at the time when it started was really a reaction to very, very tight-knit and not fun-loving and not, very restrained forms of Judaism. And those Galicianers were people who celebrated, who drank, who had fun, And they even spoke Yiddish slightly different. The Galicianers and the Litvaks had little difference in dialect. And some of you might have heard it as kids. And if you are old enough, you would even hear it on the streets of the cities, because people, well, Litvaks had a way of speaking Yiddish where the words would sometimes be a little different. And you'd hear them. You'd say, like, one group would say kugel and one group would say kugel. And you'd say, well, why do these people do it? Well, because, why do they say these things? Because they came from different parts of Eastern Europe. And there's lots of examples of the difference. It's the same words, but it's just bright or Brett, it's bread, but they had slightly different ways of speaking it. And about 33 years ago, I actually was in Ukraine. I was in Kiev for 5 days, and I was in Odessa for 5 days, and I was visiting with refuseniks. I was visiting with Soviet Jews who were not allowed to leave. And they would be thankfully allowed to leave, and some of them decided not to leave, by the way. Some of those Jews decided to actually rebuild Jewish lives in Ukraine, in an independent Ukraine. But at that moment, in 1989, no one really knew what would happen. But I will tell you that a lot of the Jews there were very worried about Ukrainian independence. I'll not hide this from you, and it doesn't make any excuse for what's happening today, because it turned out much better than they thought. But they were very worried that Ukrainian independence would lead to anti-Semitism. I don't think they could have believed that 30 years later there would be actually Jewish president of their country. I don't think they could have ever believed that, because the history was not a good one when it came to the independence movements in Ukraine, because it often was anti-Jewish, it was anti-Russian, it was oftentimes communist, and a lot of Jews were involved in all of those things. So it was a weird time to be there. But one of the things that I thought about was how lucky I was that I was there visiting and I didn't have to stay, that I'd be able to get back on a plane and go back to the United States. And I thought how weird it was that by a weird twist of fate, that my family left that cold part of the world and moved to a pretty cold part of America. They went to Minnesota and Canada, and maybe because it reminded them back of their shtetls in Ukraine, in Galicia. But I thought how lucky we were to have been born in this country. And so now we kind of think about this area right now, our attention's been turned back. And for a lot of us, we should be really glad that we live in this country, because the differences in our lives are profound. Because when I was there in Ukraine, I was there about 4 years after Chernobyl. And you know that there are tanks and that there are troops right now in that area. And the people in Chernobyl, the people who lived in that area, which is only about 50 miles from Kiev, when I was there, they all had to go out and get their own Geiger counters so they could measure the radioactivity in their neighborhood, in their food, because they couldn't trust the government. They couldn't trust the Soviet Union to tell them the truth about where the radioactivity was. And so they went out and did it themselves. And that's what the Ukrainians are hoping not to go back to right now, to a government that they can't believe, to a government that will lie to them, that will tell them that they're being liberated when they're obviously being occupied. And they don't want to go back to that. No one should ever have to go back to that. But I'll tell you, all of us, especially those of us who have a history back to that place, should be very grateful tonight that we live here and we don't have to live with that type of fear. So we're definitely praying for peace for that area. We're praying for an end to totalitarianism and an end to dictatorships all around the world, because this type of behavior can only exist when you have a brutal thug, a dictator in charge. So we're going to be praying for those people, praying for a swift end to the violence and to the destruction. Who knows? Maybe tomorrow we'll wake up to a better situation. But it's always been our belief that there'll be a better tomorrow. Right now, we're going to say our prayer for healing. We're going to include in our thoughts and minds those people that are being literally injured as we speak, maybe right now. And so we'll pray for their health, their recovery, which is a completely unnecessary situation, but it's one that we are thinking about right now. We have to. It's necessary for us to think about them. So as we pray for healing now, and we're going to sing the version of the healing prayer, El Na Rafana Allah, but we ask you to say the names of the individuals, of the people that you're personally thinking of right now in your family, your friends, your circle that you're thinking of now. So if we go around the room, you can say their names.